People who grow up on the same land don't always grow up with the same idea of what that land is worth. For some, it is money and title, and the weight of a name signed on a deed. For others, it is the smell of the earth after the first rain of May, and the memory of a father's hands, and the knowledge that every fence post they set together. Aurelio Vega was the second kind. His brother Gerardo was the first. And for 44 years, Aurelio never understood that this difference was going to cost him everything, until the day it did, and then cost Gerardo something he hadn't planned to lose. If you believe that loyalty is its own kind of inheritance, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so you don't miss a single story. This one is from the hills of Jalisco, and it belongs to anyone who has ever worked for something with their whole life and watched someone else walk away with the papers. Aurelio Vega had been working the land of Rancho El Salzal since he was old enough to saddle a horse without a step stool, which was around age 9, which was also roughly the age at which his older brother Gerardo had decided that the ranch was not where he intended to spend his life. Gerardo left at 22 for Guadalajara, came back for holidays and funerals, sent money when he remembered, and called their father Don Isidoro on his birthday every year to remind him that he was still, technically, a son. Don Isidoro accepted this. He was a patient man with a long memory and a habit of saying less than he knew. Aurelio stayed, and the years passed the way years pass on working land, not in a straight line but in circles, each harvest bringing you back to the same field, the same fence, the same sky. A little older each time and more certain that this was the only life that made sense. He had Canelo for 11 of those years. Canelo was a ranch dog of the reddish-brown kind that has no proper breed name because he was too practical for pedigree, with ears that stood up when something interested him and a habit of sleeping at the entrance to the granary as if he had been assigned there by someone with authority. Don Isidoro had found him as a pup under a mesquite near the lower fence and brought him home in the front pocket of his work shirt. He became the old man's dog first. Then, after Don Isidoro's health began to fail, he became Aurelio's shadow, following him through the morning rounds, sitting near the stove while dinner was made, watching the road in the evenings as though he was waiting for something he couldn't name. Don Isidoro died on the 1st of March, on a morning that was cold and clear in the way that early spring mornings in Jalisco can be, when the air smells like wet stone and the Sierra is still wearing its winter color. He died in his bed, with his boots on the floor beside him and his rosary in his hand, and Aurelio was the one who found him, because Aurelio was always the one who was there. He sat with his father for a while before he called anyone, the way a man sits with something that is finished and cannot be undone, and the only sound in the room was Canelo breathing at the foot of the bed. Gerardo arrived 3 days later. He came in a vehicle Aurelio didn't recognize, with a woman Aurelio had met once, and a briefcase that he set on the kitchen table before he had even greeted the hands or walked the land. The notary came the following morning. The will was read in the kitchen, where Don Isidoro had eaten every meal of his adult life, at the table he had built himself from oak planks hauled down from the Sierra. The document gave Rancho El Salzal the cattle, the water rights, the equipment, and the title to the house to Gerardo Vega as the firstborn son. To Aurelio it gave the words "a fair settlement to be arranged between brothers," which is a phrase that means nothing when one brother is holding the deed and the other is not. Gerardo looked at Aurelio across the table and said, with the tone of a man announcing something that is already settled, "I'm going to need the house. Aurelio, you can have the month to sort yourself out." The notary looked at his papers. The woman looked at the window. Aurelio looked at his brother and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would change what was written, and he had always known that words without land behind them are just sound. 3 days after the reading of the will, Gerardo came to find Aurelio in the lower pasture where he was patching the fence. The same stretch of fence he had patched every spring for 15 years, and told him that the cattle buyer from Tepetitlan was coming on Friday and that Aurelio should not be present for that meeting. "It's a business matter," Gerardo said. "It'll go smoother if it's just me." The cattle buyer was a man named Figueroa, who had done business with Don Isidoro for 20 years and who knew Aurelio by name and had shaken his hand at every transaction. Aurelio set down his pliers and looked at his brother and said nothing. The woman from Guadalajara was standing at the gate watching. She looked away when Aurelio looked up. That evening Aurelio told Don Prospero what had happened, and Don Prospero said only, "Your father knew what he was doing," and would not explain further. Aurelio didn't push. He had learned long ago that Don Prospero gave things when he was ready to give them, and not before. He spent the month sorting himself out, which meant moving what was his tools, his clothes, a wool blanket, the framed photograph of himself and his father taken the year they finished building the water tank, and Canelo, into the old granary at the back of the property. The granary was not Gerardo's yet, technically, because the property transfer was still being processed, and Aurelio used that technicality the way a drowning man uses a floating board, not as a solution, but as a reason to keep his head above the surface a little longer. The granary was stone and wood and smelled of old grain and dry rope. Aurelio swept it out, hung the photograph on the nail that was already in the wall, spread his blanket on the cot he dragged in from the shed, and sat down on the dirt floor with Canelo beside him. Outside, through the gap in the wooden door, he could see the house where he had lived for 44 years. The lights were on in the kitchen. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily, but he sat there for a long time in the half-dark, with his hand on the dog's back, and Canelo put his chin on Aurelio's knee and stayed very still, the way dogs do when they understand something is wrong without needing it explained. What Aurelio did not know yet, what none of them knew in those first cold days of March, was that the granary held something that had been waiting there for over a year, patient as the stone walls around it, waiting for exactly this moment. The first night in the granary was the longest. Aurelio lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling beams and listened to the sounds of the property the way you listen to something you have always taken for granted and are suddenly afraid you are hearing for the last time. The cattle moving in the dark, the familiar creak of the windmill near the water tank that he and his father had built together the summer Aurelio turned 30, the bark of a dog somewhere down the valley answering Canelo's silence. The photograph of himself and his father stared at him from the wall, faint in the moonlight that came through the door gap. In the photograph, Don Isidoro had his arm around Aurelio's shoulder and was squinting into the sun and smiling the way he only smiled when he was outside, on the land, doing something that made sense to him. Aurelio had always liked that photograph for that reason. He turned over on the cot and faced the wall and let the night pass the way nights pass when there is nothing useful to do with them. The following morning he was up before the sun, which was also habit, and he made coffee on the small iron brazier he had moved from the shed, and Canelo sat beside him while the water heated and watched him with that steady, undemanding attention that was the thing Aurelio had come to rely on, without quite realizing he was doing so. The days that followed were the heaviest Aurelio had known since his mother died, and they had a different quality than grief, because they were not about loss alone but about injustice, which is harder to carry because it has a face and an address and a telephone number in Guadalajara. He rose early from habit, did what work he could on the margins of the property, the fence on the east side that no one had touched in 2 years, the drainage ditch near the lower pasture that flooded every spring, not because anyone had asked him to, but because the land needed it, and he did not know how to not do what the land needed. Don Prospero came on the third morning, before the sun was fully up, walking down from his own small property on the hill with a cloth tied around a pot of beans and a stack of tortillas wrapped in a towel. He was 73 years old and had known Don Isidoro since before either of them had land of their own, and he set the food down on the wooden crate Aurelio was using as a table and said nothing beyond eat, and sat down on an upturned bucket and waited. "You knew about the will," said Aurelio. "I knew your father," said Don Prospero. "It's the same thing." "No," said the old man. "It isn't." He didn't explain. He ate a tortilla, looked at Canelo, looked at the photograph on the wall, and was quiet in the particular way of men who are carrying information they are not yet ready to give. Don Prospero came back the next morning, and the one after that, and within the first week it had become a ritual neither of them announced. The old man arrived before first light with food wrapped in a cloth, set it on the crate, sat on the bucket, and kept Aurelio company while the morning gathered itself outside the granary door. They talked about the land sometimes, about the fence on the east side that still needed work, about the state of the cattle and whether the water in the lower tank was holding up through the dry weeks. They talked about Don Isidoro, sometimes too, in the careful way of men for whom grief is a private country they visit briefly and don't linger in. And sometimes they didn't talk at all, and those mornings were the ones Aurelio found he was most grateful for, because there is a kind of company that doesn't require words and is more honest for it. Canelo was present for all of it, moving between them with the easy familiarity of a creature who has decided that these two men and this granary constitute the whole of his world and is content with that arrangement. He slept in his corner, in the hollow of dirt he had started digging that first week. He went out with Aurelio on the morning rounds and came back and ate and slept again. He did not howl or pace or show any sign of the anxiety that dogs sometimes develop when their circumstances change suddenly. He was, as Don Prospero said one morning, watching him cross from the door to his corner with characteristic calm, a dog who knows something the rest of us don't. Aurelio had thought it was just a thing to say. He would understand later that it wasn't. Canelo noticed Don Prospero the way he noticed everything, with his ears up and his nose working, and a kind of stillness that meant he was thinking. He sniffed the old man's boots, walked to the corner of the granary where his sleeping spot was, a worn patch of dirt he had chosen the first night and returned to every night since, and began to dig. Aurelio watched him. He had watched Canelo dig in that corner twice before, in the first week, and had assumed it was the dog's instinct to hollow out a cooler sleeping surface. But this morning was different. Canelo dug with a purpose that was not about comfort, his paws working fast, his nose down into the hole. And after 2 minutes he stopped and looked at Aurelio with the direct, focused look of a dog who has done what he was supposed to do. Aurelio walked over. Don Prospero stood up from his bucket. In the hollow that Canelo had opened, under 8 inches of packed dirt, wrapped in a square of oilcloth tied with twine, was a small wooden box. It was a simple box, the kind a man makes himself on a winter afternoon when he has something that needs protecting, with a fitted lid and no lock, because a lock would have attracted attention, and a man who buries something in dirt doesn't want attention. Aurelio looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Don Prospero. The old man's face said nothing, but his eyes were wet. Aurelio picked up the box and carried it to the crate and opened it. Inside, folded in the oilcloth, was a document. It was handwritten, 6 pages, dated 15 months before Don Isidoro's death, and signed at the bottom in the old man's careful handwriting by 2 witnesses whose names Aurelio recognized, Don Prospero himself and the schoolteacher from the village. A woman named Dolores Reyes, who had taught both Vega brothers to read, and who had since retired to her sister's house in Sayula. The document was a will. A second will, written after the one the notary had read in the kitchen, and it said different things. It said that Rancho El Solzal, the cattle, the water rights, and the house belonged to Aurelio Vega, who had worked the land for 22 years without wages, because the land was understood to be the wage, and who had cared for his father through 3 years of failing health, without complaint and without help from his brother, and who was the only one of Don Isidoro's sons who had treated the land as something alive and worth protecting rather than as an asset to be converted into a figure on a page. It also said, in a paragraph that Don Isidoro had written in a slightly smaller hand than the rest, as if he had added it later and wanted to be careful with the space, I am leaving this where Canelo sleeps, because Canelo has slept in that spot since the day I buried this, and I trust the dog more than I trust the process. Aurelio will find it when he needs it. He always finds what he needs. And then, just below that, in a sentence that had no legal language in it at all, forgive me for not saying this to your face. I was not good enough at the words. Aurelio read it twice. The second time he read it more slowly, especially the final paragraph, the one in the smaller handwriting, the one that had nothing legal in it. He read it a third time. Then he folded the document carefully along the same creases his father had made, and put it back in the oilcloth, and held the wooden box in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight, which was almost nothing. He thought about the last 3 years of his father's life. The mornings when Don Isidoro could no longer get to the lower pasture on his own, and Aurelio had walked beside him, not offering his arm unless the old man reached for it. The evenings when Don Isidoro sat in the chair by the kitchen window and looked at the land going dark and didn't speak, and Aurelio sat nearby and also didn't speak, and that was enough. The day Don Isidoro told him, without context or preamble, that a man could spend his whole life building something and never know if it would outlast him. And Aurelio had said that it depended on what he built it with, and Don Isidoro had looked at him for a long moment and then looked back at the window. Aurelio had thought at the time that it was just a thing his father said. He understood now that it wasn't. He sat down on the dirt floor of the granary, right next to where the box had been buried, and Canelo came and put his head in his lap, and Aurelio put both hands on the dog and stayed there for a long time while the morning light moved across the floor. Don Prospero sat back down on his bucket and let him. After a while, Don Prospero said, quietly, "He told me 2 years ago. He was afraid the notary would lose it, or that Gerardo would contest it, or that something would go wrong the way things go wrong when lawyers get involved. He wanted it somewhere safe." "Under the dog," said Aurelio. "He said the dog never moved from that spot once he put it there. Not once in 15 months. Aurelio looked at Canelo. Canelo looked back at him with the calm, ancient patience of a dog who has been carrying a secret for over a year and is glad the work is done. There was a legal process, as there always is. It lasted 4 months, and it required the testimony of Don Prospero and a letter from the school teacher Dolores Reyes, and the services of a lawyer in Lagos de Moreno who specialized in inheritance disputes, and who told Aurelio on their first meeting that his case was unusually clean for this kind of situation, which Aurelio understood to mean that his father had been thorough. Gerardo came to the granary once, in the 2nd month, when the process was already underway and he had been informed of the second will by his own lawyer. He stood in the doorway with his briefcase and his Guadalajara shoes and looked at the space where his brother had been living for 4 months, and he said, "You could have told me." "There was nothing to tell you," said Aurelio. "I found it the same week you arrived. You should have told me sooner." "You told me I had a month to sort myself out," said Aurelio, and there was no anger in his voice, only the flat clarity of a man who has thought through a conversation many times and knows exactly where it ends. I was sorting myself out. Gerardo looked at the photograph on the wall. He looked at Canelo, who was sitting in front of the cot watching him with the polite, evaluating gaze of a dog who has made up his mind about a person, but is too well-mannered to say so. "He didn't tell me," said Gerardo. "No," said Aurelio. "He didn't." That was the whole conversation. Gerardo left without saying anything more, and the shoes made the same sound going away as they had coming in. And Don Prospero, who had been sitting outside on the stone wall the entire time, heard the vehicle start and drive away and said, to no one in particular, "Some men think an inheritance is what a father gives you. It never occurs to them that it might be something you have to earn." Aurelio heard it. He didn't respond, but the words settled in him the way true things do when they arrive after a long wait. The legal transfer was completed on a Thursday in October, when the light in Jalisco turns gold in the late afternoon and the smell of the Sierra comes down into the valley on the evening air. Aurelio walked back to the house he had been born in and unlocked the front door with the key Don Prospero had kept for him. And he stood in the entrance for a moment without going in, because some thresholds need a moment before you cross them. Canelo walked in ahead of him. He went straight to the kitchen, turned once in the doorway, and looked back at Aurelio as if to say that the inventory was complete and everything was in order. Months later, when people in the village talked about the Vega brothers and the land of El Solzal, the story always found its way to the same detail: not the two wills, not the legal dispute, not even Gerardo's departure back to Guadalajara with his briefcase and his expression. The detail people remembered was the dog. The reddish-brown ranch dog who had slept on the same patch of dirt for 15 months without moving, guarding something no one else knew was there, waiting for the one person who would know what to do with it. And they said that in the years after, when things at El Solzal had settled into the rhythm of a working land again. Aurelio Vega was still out in the fields by first light, and still came in at dusk with the kind of quiet that comes from a man who has nowhere else he would rather be. Sometimes the true home is not the one written in the will you knew about. It is the one that reveals itself through the witness who stayed when everyone left, and through the creature who slept in one spot for over a year because someone trusted him with something that mattered. Aurelio Vega did not inherit the land because of a legal document. He inherited it because he had never once, in 22 years, treated it as anything less than what it was. Who showed up for you when no one else was looking? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who has given everything to something and is still waiting to know if it mattered. Until the next story. And in those years after, people who passed Aurelio Vega on the road greeted him with a nod that was not just a greeting, but an acknowledgement. The quiet respect a community gives a man who turned out to be exactly who they thought he was, and waited long enough to prove it. Canelo lay on the porch in the afternoon sun, and the land went on.